Hello everybody who's joining us. This is the Belbin webinar looking at Belbin Team Roles, the theory and the application. So what are we going to do today? We're going to look at these Belbin Team Roles. We're going to look at them in depth. We're going to see where the theory came from. And why are we going to do that? Well, we're going to do that because we often hear people saying, oh, I know Belbin, I know all about those team roles. And then you probe a bit further and you realise that perhaps somebody's heard about them on a training course or come across in another book or something along those lines. But they don't really know the depth and the understanding of where they came from. And I think that's so important nowadays because there is so much research behind these 9 team roles and behind the reports, etc., that are used globally. So we're going to go through and hopefully tell a story that will also help you remember those 9 team roles and how they can be used. So let's start with some slides here. The Belbin team roles, the theory and the application. So it starts really with 2 incredible people, and that is Dr. Meredith Belbin and Dr. Eunice Belbin, O.B.E. This is a photograph on their wedding day, which Nigel Belbin, their son, very kindly said that I could share with you all, and I think what a handsome couple they make. Meredith and Eunice met at Cambridge University. They were studying in different colleges, and Meredith was studying at Clare College and Eunice was studying at Girton College. And Meredith started to study classics but then changed to psychology, whereas Eunice studied anthropology. What they both had is a real interest in people. They were really interested in how they can predict people's behaviour, what are they going to do, and they worked a lot in consultancy after graduation, trying to understand the needs of organisations and of people. So much so that they actually formed what we call the Industrial Training Research Unit in Cambridge. And the Industrial Training Research Unit, or the ITRU, was there to really help businesses and industry become as efficient as possible by looking at the ways that they could improve work. How could they improve the training for workers and the types of work that they were given? So they really did have a great understanding about the workplace. Now, what's really interesting here is who was actually in charge, and that wasn't Meredith, it was his wife, Dr. Eunice Belbin, hence the O.B.E. for the amount of work that she did for the Industrial Training Research Unit. She was the boss. Eunice died about 15 years ago, and I would have to say that she was probably the most scarily intelligent and so kind human being that I've ever had the good fortune to meet and work with. She was incredible. But it's because they worked at the Industrial Training Research Unit that Henley Management College got in touch. So this is where it all began, this beautiful building, Henley Management College, I've been to a few times actually with Meredith. So it all began at Henley Management College in the UK. It's actually the oldest business school in Europe. And what they specialised in was bringing managers from all around the country to learn to become better managers. And they were the first college to use syndicate work to do this. So they thought that managers perhaps learned best when not being lectured to, but when they could share experiences and learn from one another. So they had syndicate working. In these syndicates, there used usually about 10 to 11 different members, and they tried to get a really good background balance for everybody within those. However, this posed a bit of a question to them because they found that some syndicates worked really well and others didn't, and they're really perplexed by this. You've got all these academics at Henley trying to work out why it was that some syndicates worked better than others. What they found was that some of those most impressive and able managers, that when they were working with others, actually had very disappointing results when they were combined. And actually some of those less impressive managers, they functioned really well together, but they couldn't work out why that was. They were unable to make any forecasts. They were unable to make any prediction as to which ones were working well and which ones weren't. So they devised an exercise. This was a 1-week exercise called the Executive Management Exercise. And instead of syndicates, they put together groups. These groups had fewer people. They had about 6 members. And it was part of a longer 10-week management programme, a precursor to an MBA, I suppose one could say. Now, this was a bit different because they had an exercise. This exercise had an output. People were successful though they weren't, and there was a monetary output, how many people, how much money they were able to make. So they had a measurable outcome. It was a competitive exercise. And this was a real game changer, because what they could then do is say, okay, we have an output, but do we have what is the input here? What is it that's making a successful team? And they were able to do it not based on their gut feel, but by actually looking at these outputs. And that's what really the Industrial Training Research Unit and the team there, which was full of absolutely incredible people. We had anthropologists, mathematicians, HR specialists, psychologists, a real mix of fabulous brains working on what was that link between the output and the input. So what were the measurements that they needed? What measurements did they need to take to be able to draw some conclusions? Well, the first one was that of the 16 PF. And we looked at the 16 personality factors. I don't know if you're familiar with this from Raymond Cattell, which really looked to see who were the people here, what was it about them. We also looked at the PPQ, which is the Personal Preference Questionnaire. And this questionnaire was devised by the Industrial Training Research Unit. And it's there to really look at people's values and motivations. And what is it that they aspire? What is it that they value? To give you a real brief overview of the PPQ, there are 50 pairs of people. And the idea is that you answer and go through this questionnaire, you find out, you decide who you prefer out of the couple of people and why. And obviously we don't really mind who you prefer, it's the reasons why, it's the words that you use that are able for us to ascertain what your values and motivations are. We also use the Watson-Glaser Critical Thinking appraisal, the CTA, and this was a level of intellect. So they also wanted to know the intellect level of the people who were attending these courses. Now, there was a little bit of criticism about the EME, the executive management exercise, due to the fact that it was a computer simulation and it didn't quite reflect true life. There was a lot of academia involved there. So they also had a new game called Teamopoly, which was a lot shorter, and it reflected normal working practices a lot better than the executive game. So they brought this new game in so that they could better judge the outcomes to find out what that link was. But that's not all. They also used what we call Bayes analysis. Now, Bayes analysis is where you use observers to record what is going on within this new game, Teamopoly, and the existing game, the EME. And this, I laugh and I hesitate because this would probably be my worst job ever, is the idea is that you record what is going on every half a minute. So every 30 seconds, you are checking to see what is going on. And what they were doing is that they were trying to find out who was doing most of the talking and also what was the nature of the talk. Were people asking, informing, proposing, opposing? Were they delegating? Perhaps they were building, or perhaps they were providing commentary, they were commentating on what was going on. So these is all of the data that they had on all of the people, the exercise and the observation of the exercises. So they had all of this to look on as well as the output, which teams were working well and which weren't. So what did they do? Well, they really wanted to take a scientific approach to this. They didn't just want to chop and change and guess what was going on. So they thought, right, what we're going to do first is we're going to put all of those who've got a really high score on the Watson-Glaser Critical Thinking appraisal, and we're going to put those together because obviously they will do well because they are the brightest of the bunch. They are the ones with the highest intellect. And surely putting those people together is going to mean that they will be successful. So in other words, they put together what we now know as the Apollo teams. They were called Apollo teams because they were asked to go into room A, which used to be Syndicate A's room, and rather than just being an impersonal A, they decided to call it Apollo because at the time, it was at the time of the moon landings. So they put these people together and they thought, excellent, will they actually be successful? What they found, in fact, was there's too much time with people saying, well, this will work, no, it won't, this is my idea, no, my idea is better than yours, no, it will work because of. Too much time spent in aborted debate, trying to persuade other people to come round to their way of thinking. They found they're very difficult to manage, and lots of difficulty in that decision-making process. Now, in fact, on average, they performed worse than any of the companies. They repeated this a lot. It wasn't just a one-off. They had around 20, 30 companies in the end that they put together as Apollo teams to see if they could replicate this, because it was very much a case of trial and replication. It's a real scientific approach. And they found that the most popular performance of an Apollo team was actually 6 out of 8. And in fact, only 3 of those teams went on to win, and there are other factors involved there as well. So they really didn't do particularly well. Phew, bit of relief for everybody else. They found actually that lack of coherent teamwork, the fact they weren't listening to each other and they weren't taking on board other people's ideas, actually nullified any gains they may have had due to their individual brilliance or effort. And looking at that Bales analysis, what really people were reporting was looking at high levels of proposing and opposing. So they were finding that there was very little other contribution being made. So what else could they do? Well, they thought, well, the Apollo teams aren't working. What we're going to do now is put together teams with similar personalities. Because surely that would work, because we tend to, similar personalities seem to sort of club together. Maybe that's it. If you've got the same mindset, the same personality, maybe that makes for the most successful teams. So what they did is they put the stable extroverts together, the anxious extroverts together, the stable introverts and the anxious introverts. And they used all this information from the 16PM. What they found is they all had their own strengths, but they also had their own weaknesses. So the stable extroverts were great. They enjoyed working with each other, quite versatile, but they were quite laid back, quite chilled. They're rather dependent on one another. They didn't notice the detail. They didn't notice the errors. So they did okay, but not brilliantly. The anxious extroverts, again, they did quite well. They did brilliantly when things were changing and they needed to look at different ideas, different options. But my goodness, they were really easily distracted and also quite unreliable. The stable introverts were fine, but they're quite slow moving. They just plodded on, so they had quite indifferent results. And the anxious introverts, they had great ideas, but because they weren't team players, it was more you had not necessarily 4, but you had individuals just sitting there, really not having much cohesion as a team, so not sharing any ideas or thoughts or ways of working. So again, they tended to have quite poor results. So what did they do? They've tried people with high intellect altogether. They've tried teams with similar personalities, and still they weren't getting anywhere. They were still no closer to finding out why some teams were successful and why some weren't successful. So they thought, what do we need to do here? So they went back to the data, and this will be a common theme actually, is they constantly went back to the data. They didn't use their gut so much as hard facts, the information they had in front. So they thought, right, what we need to do now is that we need to see if we can identify a team member that was contained within all of those successful teams. So if we looked at all of those successful teams, was there a common person amongst them? Let's have a look for them. So they did. They identified a team member who was common to all of those successful teams. They found that these were quite disciplined individuals. They had an affinity towards getting work done swiftly and in an organised fashion. They're quite conscientious. They are aware of what needed to be done for the organisation, those external obligations. They also had a well self-developed image of self. They had quite a high degree of internal control. They're therefore quite tough-minded. They were quite trusting, practical, and tolerant of others. They also tended to be conservative with a small c. They were unlikely to challenge procedures and ways of doing things that were already established. They weren't going to change any established pattern. They found, in other words, the first team role. They found the team role of implementer. And those implementers really were practical, reliable, efficient. They turned these ideas into practical actions. They were organised for work that needed to be done. The great thing about the implementer, in fact, is that they do work that needs to be done by the organisation, not work that they personally want to do. So then they put together teams of all of these implemented behaviour. So all this implemented behaviour all together, were they successful? No, well actually they weren't. They found that all implemented teams really did lack any creativity, they lacked flexibility, and they were quite slow to respond to new possibilities. And actually this is what they found throughout the work that they carried out. They found that although each of these team roles had these incredible strengths, they also had weaknesses. And we call them allowable weaknesses, and we say that they're allowable because they are the flip side of the strength. So everybody has these allowable weaknesses. Now, what I will do just now is just ask a quick question, if I may. Do you know whether or not you have Implementer as one of your top 3 Belbin team roles? Obviously, if you have a Belbin report, it will be quite easy because you know. Maybe you'd want to guess. I'm not sure. If you don't know, you don't have to answer. Don't worry, we're not going to hold you to your answer here. So we have 14 of you say yes, that you have Implementer as one of your top 3 team roles. I'm going to write it up here. So this is a team circle here, and I thought it would be great to go through and to work out what the team role distribution of this webinar team would be. So we have Implementer down here. I'm just going to write the number 14, and I think I'm going to call this the webinar team. Let's see what this looks like by the end of the day. Well, they found, like I said, that the implementers didn't have a great deal of creativity. So they started really to look at the creative roles. So how did they do that? Yes, they went back to the data, you know I was going to say that, to find out who was making the proposing contributions as a team. So remember with that Bales analysis, they were checking to see what contributions people were making. So they thought, let's find out where the ideas are coming from. Let's look at the proposals. But actually, they found that was quite difficult because there were so many people proposing. In fact, looking at the research, they found that too many ideas actually meant to very little benefit because there were too many to choose from. So instead of looking at proposing, they looked at when those breakthrough moments were happening and when there were those aha moments and where were they coming from. They found that those breakthrough moments were quite rare, they weren't plentiful, and they found that they were coming from a behaviour, they're coming from people who had a very high score on the Watson-Glaser critical thinking analysis. They had high intellect. They also found another cluster of characteristics which they looked at in depth. They thought, brilliant, we've found something out here. And then they realised that Raymond Cattell had already found it out because they'd found the formula again for creative disposition. So they could identify these individuals who had this creative disposition and also had a very high IQ. What they'd found is the team role of a plant. They tended to be very creative, imaginative, and they were great at problem solving. So what they did is that they planted, hence the name plant. It's got nothing to do with greenery, it's got nothing to do with flowers, it's entirely to do with the fact that they planted one of these individuals into each of the teams because they realised that each team needed that spark, that seed of creativity to be able to be effective. They also put plant teams together that consisted solely of plants to see if that was useful as well, but in fact it wasn't. There was too many ideas, too much disinterest in each other, so it really didn't lead to positive or effective team working at all. Because good ideas aren't always well received, but just imagine if you had a whole team of ideas coming in there. So here we had that team role of plant. But they also found that the allowable weaknesses were that sometimes they were unable to communicate effectively. There was so much going on here, they ignored the detail and they couldn't always explain to other people exactly what their ideas meant. But this was interesting because whilst they found the plant, they also came across a whole range of people who were also being creative, who were also suggesting ideas into the team, but who didn't fit this mould, who weren't scoring particularly high on the Watson-Glaser critical thinking analysis, and who weren't ticking all the boxes for this creative disposition. So who were they? Had they actually got it wrong? Had they got the data wrong? They were really puzzled. What they found is that they looked at all of these people who weren't fitting the mould of a plant. And they said, right, let's have a better look. And indeed, they were suggesting lots of ideas into the group. So they were being creative, but they tended to be more extroverted rather than the introverted, which a plant is. Their IQ was fine, it was average, but it wasn't off the scale, it wasn't as high as we were expecting to see with the plant behaviour. We also found that they were very sociable, they were enthusiastic, and they also had low anxiety. They're inquisitive, stable extroverts. What they had found was the team role of resource investigator. They had found out that actually ideas can come from elsewhere, but the resource investigators' ideas didn't tend to be new. They didn't tend to be completely left of field. They were ones that perhaps had been not stolen, I don't want to use the word stolen, but developed from working with others. They're great ones at bringing ideas back into the team that may have been developed elsewhere, because they have that close involvement with people. They know people, they're great at networking. They leave no stone unturned, and they really found treasure in unexpected spots. The relationships that they had really did open up that particular team to possibilities that other teams didn't have without this particular behaviour. Sometimes, however, they get a little bit over enthusiastic, they lose interest, they get bored very easily. But what they found is that the creativity, the ideas were coming from two different sources, and they're quite two distinctive different sources. They're that of the plant and that of the resource investigator. So what I'd love to know is, do you have one of the creative team roles in your top 3, and which do you have, or do you perhaps have both? So we have 9 who say both. So 9 plus 5 is 14 for plant. Okay, and then we have, I should put my glasses on, 7 plus 9 equals 16 for resource investigator. I was expecting that to be high for the resource investigators due to the fact that you're probably listening in thinking, now how can we use this? How can we take this back to our organisation? So where have we got to so far? We've found the really productive team role, the organiser and the implementer, and we found that creativity. Where do we need to go next? What did they look at next in the experiments at Henley? Well, what they decided they'd look for next is looking really at how the leadership of the team, the management of the team, was influencing the success. Because each of the teams tended to have somebody in the chair, somebody who was managing the exercise and everybody around them. So they wanted to know how much of an effect that person was having on the success of the team. So again, surprisingly, they went back to the data and they looked to see who was chairing the most successful teams and what can we find out about them. What was it that was making them successful? So they found the coordinator team role, and they found that actually, again, what was their IQ? Well, it wasn't off the scale up, it wasn't at the bottom. It tended to be above average for the team who were the most successful here. So above the average for the team, but only just above. And they tend to have a trusting nature, quite dominant. They had a strong and moral commitment to achieve goals. They tended to be quite calm and unflappable. They had this very sort of practical realism. They had self-discipline, but what they also did is they carried the respect of others. And I love the quote actually, which is written in management teams by Bill Hartson, which is one of the researchers who worked at Henley. He said that coordinator is somebody who's tolerant enough always to listen to others, but strong enough to reject their advice. And I think that sums it up beautifully. So, brilliant. They identified another behaviour, another team role behaviour, that of coordinator. And they found that having one of these in the team was more likely to be successful. But then they came across a bit of a quandary, really. And they came against a quandary because all these exercises that are being carried out at Henley, well, you know, they were really successful managers were attending these courses. And they found that actually there was quite a high proportion of these successful managers who weren't actually showing high coordinator behaviour. And they thought, you know, have we got this wrong? They actually took a lot of this back into industry in between each of the things that they tried out. And they thought, my goodness, what is it that these managers have if they don't have coordinator behaviour? What is it that they're bringing to the team? And they found that what they were bringing to the team was lots of sort of nervous energy. They're quite extroverted. A need for achievement was also something else that all these managers seemed to have. They challenged, they argued, and they disagreed. They, in fact, identified the team role behaviour of a shaper. They really do challenge, they're dynamic. They have resilience, they also have good humour, and they found that a lot of people, although they were quite prone to provocation of others and they upset people, and this is because it was the task which was the important bit and not the people along the way, that they were able to recover with very good humour. They had a high level of resilience, but they're also very competitive. And winning really was the name of the game. And so when they put just shaper teams together, oh my good God, there were blood on the walls, as one person put it. They didn't do particularly well. There was too much competitiveness going on. There was too much infighting, so to speak. They didn't work well together. So there they found two different types of person who was successful in that more leadership role. That was the coordinator, and then this particular behaviour, which was shaper. So let's find out again how many of you have these behaviours in your top 3. So we have 4 for shaper, 13 coordinators, that's quite high. Both we only have 4, and it's difficult, isn't it? Because we're all a wonderful mixture of all of these team roles. We're really not just one at all. But actually, if you have shaper and coordinator in your top roles, you really have to make it clear which role you're playing at the time, because they are very, very different. They're both dominant, but they show their dominance in very, very different ways. So it's 8 for shaper. Have a look down here. And then coordinator, we have, I think that says 13, that's also 17. Here we go. We're beginning to have a bit of a picture there of those, and we'll look at those in a sec. Right, I'm going to go back to the slideshow. So what was next? Well, what they found is that when different ideas were being suggested to the group, they really wanted to work out who was it who was deciding which of those was really a good idea to take forward. And they did find that it wasn't necessarily the person in the chair, because very often it goes to the person in the chair, the person who has more of that dominance decides which way to go. But they found the most successful teams were the people who separated that out. And they found that there were certain types of behaviour which were very discerning, were able to take sort of the emotion out of the decision making, and they found the team we call monitor evaluator. They're really able to weigh up the pros and cons and to work out which of those ideas were going to be the most successful going forward. They found the monitor evaluator also had quite a high IQ, so it was very high on the Watson-Glaser critical thinking analysis, and this was really important. Why was this important? It was important because you needed somebody to be able to sometimes challenge the plant. So if the plant is scoring very high on Watson-Glaser, then the monitor evaluator needed to be able to have that conversation as to why that idea would or wouldn't work. They found the monitor evaluators actually only really came to the fore at these critical times. They were quite low profile otherwise. So again, let's have a look to see what we have here in this webinar. Do we have a higher amount of monitor evaluator? Let's have a look here. So the monitor evaluator is the one who takes the emotion out, is able to weigh up the pros and cons, and always makes the right decision. Now, you may not have it in yourself, but I wonder as well whether or not you recognise it in your colleagues, because sometimes the monitor evaluators are difficult to spot, but from a body language point of view, they're the ones that are sitting back with their arms folded. They're the ones listening, but not necessarily contributing. They're the ones that you can tell are just taking it all in before they make a decision. So, do you have it in your top 3? 12 of you say yes. Wow, this is good. And don't worry, you monitor evaluators, all of this data and the whole recording is available for you afterwards to go through in your own time and to make the right decisions for you. And brilliant. Look at how many of you can recognise monitor evaluators in others. That is fantastic, because that's the key thing, isn't it, is knowing where else these behaviours actually are. Okay, let's go back now. So have they found them all yet? No, they haven't. Then another team role came in, and this is the team worker, and the team worker was really noticed because some of these teams had a tendency to really exclude others. Some people's voices weren't quite loud enough, and they found that they weren't being listened to. And really these team workers, they stood out as an exception because they're the ones that saved the day. They made helpful interventions which would avert friction, which would ensure that voices were heard, that really gelled the team to make sure that the team kept together. And they tend to be very cooperative, they're diplomatic, they have a massive amount of empathy and listening skills. Again, what they did with the teamwork is that they placed any group objectives above their own. What to them was important was the team, not themselves. And they had very high sociability scores, they had very low dominance scores. And so they're very trusting, very sensitive, and very interested in human behaviour. However, they weren't so great in a crunch situation. They didn't really want to say yes or no. They didn't want to upset people. But this was okay because what they were bringing with this wonderful amount of empathy and listening skills. So again, do we have any team worker behaviour in your top 3? 18 we're going to put there. Wow, that's quite high. We've got a lot of team workers here. Brilliant. So back to sharing my screen here. What else did they find? Well, they found that some of the teams actually failed at the final hurdle, that these most successful teams, which they looked were doing really, really well, what happened? And it was the lack of attention to detail. So they found the most successful team also had what we call the completer finisher behaviour. And these are the ones who were really looking for the detail, the ones who could search out errors. They had high anxiety because they didn't want anything to be wrong. Interestingly, the term completer finisher is a bit of a misnomer because they don't tend to finish, because everything can always be that little bit better, can always, be polished to be more effective. Now, attention to detail is not a trivial matter, it really isn't. So this person who has the capacity for this relentless follow-through is an absolute asset to every team. In fact, they found those who had a cavalier attitude towards detail, that had quite a low regard towards these sort of obligations, because those teams didn't do so well. They may have looked brilliant to start with, but then that was it. They failed at the last. So here we have the completer finisher. Again, the anxiety is needed. So although it is seen as an allowable weakness, it really is required to ensure that people, want to look at the detail, want to do as well as they can. So let's look at this question here. We often hear the cry, we hear it a lot in the Belbin office, I need somebody to CF this for me, I need a completer finisher. Would you be able to help? How many completer finishers do we have who have completer finishers in their top 3? Do we have in the webinar? Is it, could we have 8 there? We have 8. We have different, no. Most importantly, and this is the crucial thing, is that you know somebody who can. And that's really what we're looking for here. You may not have those strengths yourselves, but who has? Can we find somebody else who can? Fantastic. So that was it really for the work they did at Henley. They found that the most successful teams had access to these 8 different team roles. They found that they could predict the performance of these teams, and they could predict their success, whether or not they came first through to 9th, with over 80% of accuracy, that they could look at the teams, look at them on paper and decide, put their thoughts in a sealed envelope, and were able to predict who was going to be the most successful teams. But that wasn't the end. And a lot of people who think there's just 8 team roles, that's only part of the story, because as they did throughout this research, they went back into industry to find out whether or not this was just academic or whether or not this was, as my children would say, real true life. And what they found actually was a 9th behaviour. They found a 9th behaviour of the specialist, and the specialist, the one who really brought to the team a depth of knowledge about a particular subject. Now, I don't particularly like the term specialist because it implies a job title, and it's really not about job title here. It's about people who have a thirst for knowledge, who really have a love of learning, and ones who want to see beyond the bullet point and have that depth of knowledge and understanding. And this does mean that they can often only contribute on a narrow front, but it doesn't matter, because you actually need that at a particular time of the project, perhaps, or what the team is there to do. So they found this 9th team role was critical, this 9th behaviour, and that of specialist. So this research, it really hasn't just stopped, it's continued, and we're now on almost our 8th version of Belbin. We are constantly reviewing this to ensure that we are still measuring what we're meant to measure, and that these roles are as equally important, and luckily they are. So let's just have this last poll now. Do we have any specialist behaviour here within this webinar? So do you have a love of learning? Do you have letters after your name? So specialists are all to do with really high professional standards. So it may belong to a particular professional body, perhaps. A love of learning. I'm expecting to see this as relatively high, actually, because you're on a webinar. You'll want to learn more about Belbin Team Roles. In fact, 18 of you have got a really high score. Well, we've got 18 of you who are scoring specialists there. Thank you very much. Okay, let's come out of that. I'm just going to look at this. Well, we can see we have coordinator, team worker, specialist, resource investigator is quite high there. The shaper not. You're cracking on with other things. You haven't got 45 minutes to an hour just to sit and listen to something fine like that. Completer finisher, you're probably not, because you're finishing something else that somebody's just given you. So perhaps that's why there's fewer of you there. But we do have this lovely range, and that specialist who's looking for that knowledge to be able to understand more depth about these 9 particular team roles. So what they found is the most effective team has all of these 9 team role behaviours there. But it's not good enough just knowing, oh, they're all there. Each member needs to understand their team role, strengths and weaknesses, and that of the people that they work with. And they need to put together relationships that really exploit these strengths and contain the weaknesses. So people really need to understand themselves. It starts with you. It starts with understanding your own behaviour, understanding that of others, understanding that of the team, being able to build up a picture, as we've done very crudely here, of everybody who's on the webinar, and being able to become really effective team members. So what we need to be an effective team member is timing. We need to know the contribution that we need to make and when to make it. We need to have flexibility. We need to know which of our team role strengths we're playing and when we're playing them. We need to have self-restraint. We need to ensure that we're not stepping on the toes of other people when they're making their contributions. Now, when there is a void within a team, you also need to announce that you can't fill that, because very often people say, oh, I'll do that then. No, announce that you can't do it to allow somebody else to fill into that void if you're going to be an effective team member, and also have that sense of reality. So I'm now going to answer those questions that have just come up. I'm just going to put that there. Simply putting together a number of people and expecting them to work as a team is not enough. I can't say that often enough. So what we have is these team roles, and just to really, go back to what is a team role, it's a tendency. It's not an absolute. It's not a you will always. You will tend to behave, contribute and interrelate with others in a particular way. It's also to do with behaviour. This isn't to do with a personality. It's to do with the way that you interact with other people. So it's a tendency. And we know that these behaviour can change. So we have our personality that links in with our behaviour. We have our mental abilities, our values, our motivations. But also, and hopefully this will answer some of the questions, our experience of life and of work will influence the way that we behave. So the way that we experience different cultures, we have experienced different managers, different work colleagues. The more we learn about ourselves and our reaction to these experiences will change our behaviour. So because this has an influence on our behaviour, it's key to know that your behaviour isn't static and it will change depending on the situation that is around you. And that also goes in with this external influences. And we have probably the most dramatic of these external influences happening right this very second, is that these things that we can do nothing about, which we have no control over, which we used to give the example of perhaps a company merger or something along those lines, where we can just say, due to the current pandemic, this will affect the way that we behave. Working from home is affecting the way that we behave. So we change. You would expect to change because we're not just one thing. We are a mixture of all of these 9 different behaviours, and we need to work out which one is appropriate to play and when it is. And the more we understand the language of Belbin and that role learning that comes in, the more that we'll be able to do that. So really, how does Belbin differ to other things? Well, you have your DNA. This is the anchor of you. It's very much fixed. Further up there, we have your personality. Who are you? And this is where the 16BF comes in. This is where MBTI comes in. And this is where other personality tools come in, because they are concerned about you as the individual. What we're concerned at Belbin is not what we are, but what we do, how we interact and behave with others. So it's the ship that you're seeing at the top there. And this is really what differentiates Belbin, is because we're saying it can change. We don't expect it to come out the same every time you have a questionnaire. The key difference, however, is because behaviour is based on the workplace. Actually, are we the best people to say what our strengths and weaknesses are, how we behave? Actually, we may not be, because that requires a great deal of self-awareness. In fact, they found the most successful team members are the ones who had the highest amount of self-awareness. And how do we become self-aware? We really have to ask the opinion of others. So you fill in a questionnaire, the self-perception inventory, you find out what you feel for each of those 9 team roles. But that's only, you know, limited use, isn't it? And that's how we differ from a lot of the other tools, is that we say what is key is asking other people to complete what we call an observer assessment. How do they see your behaviour? And this can give you such wonderful, wonderful feedback. You can find out more about you, your self-awareness. You can learn more about your best contribution by understanding how others see you. And also you can learn how to be a strong example of a type. So not just being an okay plant, but a really strong example of a plant. Again, by this learning, as we've said, you know, be a strong example of a coordinator by learning what it needs, what you need to do to become that strong example. So you need to complete a questionnaire, and you need to ask people to feedback on you. Now, you can just do the questionnaire by itself, just the Belbin SPI, find out what you did, but make sure it's a proper version, it's been properly researched, not just a freebie you found on the internet, because that's not Belbin, even if it may have Belbin or team roles on it. So have a proper self-perception inventory, get feedback from others, and then you'll generate a report which will give you a fingerprint of how you feel for each of these 9 team roles, combined with what other people are seeing as well. This is just one of the pages of the report you can generate. This is another one, how you see yourself, how others see you. Do different people see different behaviours? And you'd expect that they would, because you'd expect your manager to see slightly differently to your work colleagues. And we do ask you only to ask people who you've worked with closely and whose judgment you trust to be able to give that feedback. You'll be able to see here in terms of Sam T, whether or not they're seeing the same amount of each of those behaviours that you see in yourself. So Sam doesn't see that they have that much team worker, but the rest of the team's seeing quite a lot. That's something that you really need to know. You need to know where is the most valuable contribution that you can make. You need to understand what other people think. What else can you find out? Well, you can find out whether or not people are seeing just the strengths of each of those team roles, or whether or not they're seeing those allowable weaknesses as well, and whether or not those allowable weaknesses start to outweigh those strengths. And you can see the words that everybody is using to describe you. This makes each report absolutely unique, because all that the observers are doing are ticking words that they think really describe you more than anybody else. And this is where the list of words comes in. So you have all of this information at your fingertips the second you have that Belbin individual report. These are just some of the pages. You can also see what sort of working style you'd be best suited towards. And once everybody has that, you can make the contribution that we have beside us. Where are the gaps and the overlaps in the team? Work out which contributions people should be making. All you need there is for everybody to have completed an individual one, and you can create what we call a team report. Where are the gaps? Where are the overlaps? Are you cloning? Are you recruiting people just like you? Do you have enough diversity, behavioural diversity in the team? What are the averages? Where are those strong examples of each of those team roles? What are the averages? What is the culture of the team? And what words collectively could you use to describe the team that you're working in? These are just some of the many reports that people are using worldwide, because it is such a useful, practical tool. And this is why 30, 40 years down the line that we are still taught, in fact, increasingly so, on management courses and business schools and universities across the globe. We have an incredible network of distributors who help spread the language and knowledge of Belbin worldwide. And this is because it's not just useful for the individual, it's useful for the managers, the teams, the departments and the organisations. They find that, you know, Belbin, having the language of Belbin helps managers make that transition from becoming a great process manager to an outstanding people manager, understanding what everybody is bringing to your team. As Meredith put, simply putting together a number of people and expecting them to work as a team is not enough. So thank you for listening to me for that amount of time. I'm going to stop sharing my screen now. We're back here. What I will do now is say thank you very much for everybody who stayed with us, and remember that simply putting together a number of people and expecting them to just work as a team is not enough. Belbin can help you with that. Thank you very much.